Oh, my guest right now is Tim Lukings. His book is a play on Footloose and Fancy Free, Fruit Loose and Fancy Tree. Well, we'll get to that. Now, there's a church building. That looks like one of the churches in the little village of Brighton. Now, it isn't, I know, but Norma Jean and I, Tim, welcome.
Thank you.
When I was 22, she was 19, I was still a student for the ministry, and I became the pastor of a church in Brighton, Ontario. Now that's partway to between Toronto and Montreal along the number 2 highway. And Norma Jean was 19-year-old pastor's wife, but we enjoyed almost 3 years there, and then you came some time later, and you actually moved us across the tracks. You built a new building in Brighton. I had the privilege of being there. What are your memories of Brighton?
Oh, Brighton was a wonderful place where God just moved, and we saw many people come to know Christ, and it was just a wonderful place. Just a small town where family was family, and the whole town seemed like family.
And we could talk about lots of people. Our church members,
yes.
They were memorable, wonderful, warm-hearted people, and it was a great place for Norma Jean and I to start. And so there was a trail derailment there. Were you there at that time? A train derailment,
right behind the church building, in fact. But no, we had moved just a week or two prior to that. Yes.
Oh boy, Brighton was in the news there.
Yes.
Your book, Fruit Loose and Fancy Free, is the result of what? Was there an experience in your life or something that gripped you with a passion because if you're going to discipline yourself to write a book, you got to have some passion, some fire in your soul.
What gripped me was reading through the book of Acts. And
that's the history book of the early Christian church.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I'd read it many times, but for some reason, I suddenly I came to a realization of the incredible impact that the church had on its community in those early chapters, particularly between chapters 2 and 10, and the relatively small impact that many of our churches was having on our communities here in Canada. In fact, I recently heard my senior pastor was at a meeting with Christian leaders from across Canada, and he came back with numbers of statistics and told us that 70% of churches in Canada have either flatlined or in decline.
Oh,
and that's a startling statistic.
Because I don't necessarily have a lot of faith in statistics.
Well, that's valid.
Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, he said there are statistics at the bottom of the list, lies, and then blank lies, and then statistics in descending order. So, because God's the only one that really knows.
True, absolutely true.
And so I don't want to believe what you said, but we better pull up our socks anyway.
Well, the point of the matter is that in a matter of a few days, a church grew from 120 to 5,000.
Back in the first century.
Back in the first century. And I don't know if that will be repeated again, but I do know that there's some things that we can do to adjust, I believe, to increase the impact of our lives and our churches on our communities.
Now those 5,000, by the way, had been sitting for 3.5 years or standing under the ministry of Jesus.
Yes.
And many of them had been healed by Jesus. True. They had seen Lazarus risen from the dead, or the pilgrims were down there. Of course, when the tourists left, because there's a whole list of people that came from countries, the last name on the list is the Arabs, down at the bottom of the list, of people who came and believed. But when they left, there may have been left with a church of 200 or 300, would you think, in Jerusalem by the time all those pilgrims and tourists left, because it was a feast weekend.
That's true.
In Jerusalem.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I don't know the numbers again, but certainly the church would be much less significant.
But the thing was, they would not withdraw themselves. They didn't build a little church on a back street somewhere.
No.
They went to the temple every day. And the priests that were leading the liturgy may have been some of those that had connived to crucify Jesus.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet they refused to separate themselves from the center of the culture.
Yes.
Is that an important point if we're going to bear fruit as a church?
I think it is. I think that we need to be part of our community. We need to involve ourselves in the culture in which we live. And we need to continue to do the work of Jesus Christ. Because as you said, many of those people had seen and had been impacted by the ministry of Christ. And and yet that same work continued through the apostles, through the disciples, and people continued to be healed. Dead people continued to be raised.
I haven't seen that happen lately.
No, I haven't seen that happen.
I hear about it in Africa,
yes,
where people's faith is strong and simple, and they don't have all this world's goods. They only have God.
Yes. Yes. I think, one of the things that I say in the book a couple of times, and I still have so much growing to do in this area myself, but the Holy Spirit simply has not changed. He hasn't gotten old and powerless over the period of 2,000 years. So it must be us that's changed, because we saw him working through the disciples and through the early Christians just the way Jesus went about doing his ministry. And I've come to the realization that there's really no reason why we as Christians and we as a church can't move in that same kind of power, because God and the Holy Spirit are the same.
Well, to get Tim's book and to know more about Tim, or even to contact him, he's now an associate pastor of a congregation in the Paris-Brantford, Ontario area. You can go into the crossroads.ca website, and all the guests are always listed there. And get his book and purchase his book from him. You'll get an address, how to reach Tim. Tim, your chapter titles are really intriguing. Chapter number 1, fruit salad, no nuts, please. Now, I heard Jim Candelon say that most of the nutcases, the religious nutcases in the world, are attracted to Jerusalem, and he had to deal with a lot of them over those years as a pastor in Jerusalem. But what are the nuts? How's this no nuts, please thing?